I'm going to demonstrate how to do the satin stitch on these three shapes here. I'm going to start off with this simple square. Now I usually, whenever I'm stitching any shape that can be divided into two, like a symmetrical shape, I will always start off with a single stitch down the center to divide the shape in half. Then I'm going to fill one side of it with satin stitches and then the other. You're trying to keep your stitches nice and close together without overcrowding them. Now I'm using the sewing stitch method, which means I stab my needle in and bring it straight out on the other side. And I'll just show you how closely together I'm laying down my stitches. There they are. So my needle goes in and then comes back out. Nice and close, and you're trying to keep the lines parallel. The idea is to fill that shape completely solid with your stitches. Now I'm using all 6 strands of embroidery thread here, so I can afford to keep a slight gap, I guess you would say. They don't need to be right up close, almost on top of each other. You can actually afford to leave a tiny little gap. I'll just show you how closely my needle is going in and coming out. So you can see that it is quite close to where this thread is coming out and here, but I'm still leaving a little bit of a gap. The thickness of the thread is what closes up those gaps. Now, the trick with a good satin stitch is you have to make sure that your stitches are parallel to each other so that you get an even finish. I'll just do one more stitch to finish that off. And now I'm going to come out straight away on the other side, and then I'm going to fill in that side there. And my thread is almost finished, so I'm going to rethread, and I'll just show you on the reverse. This is the way that I like to finish off my satin stitch. I'm going to slide the needle under those 2 stitches there, pull the thread all the way out, slide it under again under the same 2 stitches. Before you pull it all the way out, keep that little loop, pull the needle through, pull tight, and then snip that away. Now I've put new thread onto my needle, but as you can see, I couldn't actually find the same color pink, so I'm going to continue with a slightly lighter shade. Now as you can see, there's our square satin stitch in 2 different pinks, but never mind. What you're going for is a nice even finish with a nice smooth sort of feel to it. Now let's do the circle. I'm just going to jump straight out and do the circle. Now the reason I'm showing you how to do a circular shape is because it's important to note how to finish a round shape on both sides. Over here we had a square, so it's easy to know where the square finishes because there's a straight line there and a straight line there. With a circle, you sort of need to taper it a little bit, and the reason I wanted to show you is because I see people making the same mistake quite often when they do a circular shape. So the first couple of stitches will be the same size, and then you're following the line work, making the stitches smaller and smaller. Now, if you have a look at that, it looks like I could probably fit another 2 stitches over here, but I'm only going to do 1, and I'm going to come out to the other side straight away. And this is the important thing that I wanted to show you. Quite often what I see is people tend to do another stitch and another stitch, thinking that the stitches that taper off on either side should continue to keep getting smaller and smaller. If we added another stitch here and another stitch there, you can probably see that I would have ended up with an almond shape. Instead, I'm finishing off with one long, sort of long looking stitch, and I'm going to leave it there. If I feel that I still need to round it off a little bit more, I can always come back to it and add another stitch. But at this stage, I'm just going to continue and stitch the other side. Now, the reason that I stitch one half first and then the other half is because by laying that center stitch down, I only need to worry about keeping two small halves nice and straight with parallel lines. If I started off, let's say over here, and stitched in this direction, by the time I get halfway, quite often what I see is that the stitches are starting to lean over to one side or to the other. If we lay down the center stitch first, do one half and then the other, we have a much greater chance of keeping those stitches nice and parallel in straight lines. Now, let's finish this one off. I'm just going to stab in one last stitch and we'll see what it looks like. Now, if you look at that from a distance, to me, that looks absolutely fine, and I would leave it exactly as it is. I know that some people are still tempted to add another little stitch there and another little stitch there, but I urge you to do less and then check. If you feel that you still need another stitch, you can always go back. Now I wanted to show you how to do a shape like this, which fans from one side to the other like that. Meaning we're not just placing parallel stitches side by side moving in this direction. We have to start off here, but we need to finish there. And we do that by using half stitches. The first thing that I'm going to do is lay down 3 guide stitches to show me where I should be at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end. This means that from here to here, I only need to worry about that half little section to make my stitches turn. I don't need to think about that entire shape. So straight away, I've made it a little bit easier for myself by breaking it down into 2 halves. So I'm going to come up over here. Now, you can probably see already that if I continue laying my stitches down parallel, by the time I get to the center, they're going to be in the wrong place. So the way to make them turn is by adding half stitches. And I'll show you how to do that now. First of all, there's a full stitch there, but I'd like to create a slight turn at this point. And so here is where I'm going to add half a stitch. So I'm not going to the end, I'm only going to do half a stitch, and then I'm coming up back at the top. There's my half stitch there. Now I'll bring that in a little bit closer so you can see. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to put the needle in there as though I'm making a full stitch, and then come up again along that outer edge. Now what happens here is that that little gap from the half stitch to the bottom there has now been closed up, and we've created a very slight turn. I'm just going to do that again. So one full stitch first, and then another half stitch, come down here, another half stitch. I can see I need to make that turn a little bit quicker. Another half stitch, now it's okay to reuse a hole down the bottom here from one of the previous stitches. Another half stitch, and I think I've just got enough thread to finish that off. So there's half stitch, and then I'm going to stab that in. Then we finish that off. And you can see how I've created that turn using those half stitches. I'm just going to change my thread and then do the other side. Okay, here we go again. I'll do a full stitch first. Now I often get asked how many half stitches and how many full stitches. That becomes like an intuitive, a little bit of intuitive guesswork there, because it will depend on the shape that you're stitching. Sometimes if you need to do a really sharp turn, then you need to do every second stitch as a half stitch. Now I don't recommend doing 2 half stitches side by side, because you're going to leave too big a gap. So if you do need to make big sharper turns, just do every second stitch as a half stitch, which is what I'm starting to do here. And you can see that I've already created quite a turn. That thread is already turning quite a bit. Now if I look at that, I probably only need 1 other half stitch, and then the final one will be a full stitch. Maybe 1 more. I think there's a tiny little gap left there. Yep. And there we are, a successful turn from one side to the other, a successful circle, and a nice looking square. I hope you found that helpful.